blood. That's what Mike Harrison saw first when he stepped from the Ranger Jeep into the clearing. Not drops or specks, but rivers of it, dark crimson soaking into the Amazon soil, filling the humid air with its metallic scent. Above, what he'd mistaken for storm clouds churned and pulsed with unnatural rhythm. Bats. Hundreds of vampire bats, swarming over something small and helpless on the forest floor. "Dear God," Frank whispered beside him. Through the writhing mass of wings, Mike caught glimpses of copper-colored hide. A newborn Brahman calf, barely visible beneath the feeding frenzy. 20 feet away stood the mother cow, massive humped and wild-eyed, her horns gleaming as she pawed the earth in desperate frustration. What they discovered that day in the Amazon would challenge everything Mike thought he knew about life, death, and the surprising bonds between species. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Manaus region of the Amazon rainforest had suffered through 3 months of unrelenting drought that summer of 2023. Rivers shrank to trickles, wildlife congregated desperately around dwindling water sources, and tensions ran high among the conservation teams tasked with managing the crisis. Chief Ranger Mike Harrison wiped sweat from his weathered brow as he studied the drought maps spread across the conference table. At 68, with retirement just 2 months away, he carried the lean, tough build of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. Vietnam had hardened him, veterinary school had educated him, and losing his family farm to debt after feral cattle destroyed his crops had nearly broken him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Now, here he was, protecting the very wilderness that harbored such animals. "We've got another water conflict brewing near the Henderson Research Station," said Jenny Thompson, the station's newest conservation biologist. At 35, she represented everything Mike both respected and found exhausting about the new generation of scientists. Brilliant, by the book, and sometimes lacking the practical wisdom that only experience could teach. "Those Brahman cattle from the Wilkins failed ranch are moving further into protected habitat," Jenny continued, adjusting her glasses. "They're competing with native species for the remaining water sources. Protocol says we should prioritize removal." Frank Williams, Mike's friend of 20 years and senior ranger, sighed heavily. "Those Brahmins have survived 3 ranching failures. Tough as nails, those beasts." Mike nodded, memories of his own losses flickering behind his eyes. "They're adaptable. Not their fault they were brought here." "But they don't belong," Jenny insisted. "Every resource they consume comes at the expense of native wildlife." The debate might have continued if not for the commotion that erupted outside. Shouts from junior rangers, a crash of equipment, and then the station door burst open. "Chief Harrison, you need to see this," called Ranger Rodriguez, his voice tight with urgency. Outside, standing in the clearing before the station, was one of the largest Brahman cows Mike had ever seen. Her silver-white coat was streaked with blood, her massive shoulder hump quivering with exhaustion. Her sharp horns, curved and deadly, had scattered the junior rangers who'd tried to drive her away. But it was her eyes that stopped Mike cold, wild with a desperate intelligence fixed directly on him. "She came straight here," Rodriguez explained. "Walked right up to the station like she knew what it was." "She's injured," Mike observed, noting the lacerations across her flank. "She's invasive," Jenny corrected, joining them, "and potentially dangerous." The cow stomped, then took 3 deliberate steps toward Mike before looking back toward the forest path she'd emerged from. She repeated the motion, unmistakable in its intent. "I'll be damned," Frank whispered. "She wants us to follow her." Director Thomas Reynolds would have a fit if they diverted resources to follow a feral cow. Protocol was clear. Yet as Mike locked eyes with the massive animal, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended species. "Get the medical kit and the high-beam lights," Mike said quietly to Frank, "and keep it off the radio for now." This is completely against protocol, Jenny protested as Mike loaded equipment into the Jeep. We're in the middle of a drought crisis meeting. Director Reynolds specifically said to prioritize native species. Mike continued working, his movements efficient despite his age. Nobody's stopping you from staying, Thompson. Frank emerged from the supply shed carrying powerful floodlights. Got the new LED arrays, Mike. Battery packs, too. The Brahmin cow paced anxiously at the edge of the clearing, her massive form casting a long shadow in the morning sun. Every few moments she would look back at the humans, then toward the forest path, her intentions unmistakable. You realize this could be your job, Jenny said, lowering her voice. 2 months from retirement and you're risking it for a feral cow? Mike paused, transfixed by a memory. His own cattle, dead or dying after the creek on his family farm dried up during the drought of '88. Sarah had left him shortly after. Couldn't bear to watch him drink himself to sleep every night, she'd said. Couldn't bear to share him with his ghosts. Some things matter more than protocol, he finally replied, securing the equipment. Frank, you ready? Frank nodded, then turned to Jenny. Coming or staying, Dr. Thompson? Third seat's open. Jenny glanced between the rangers and the anxious cow, professional objections warring with scientific curiosity. Fine, she relented. Someone needs to document this breach of protocol. The cow led them along a winding game trail, moving with surprising speed despite her obvious exhaustion. Blood still trickled from wounds on her flanks, yet she pressed forward with single-minded determination. Mile after mile, she navigated the path, occasionally looking back to ensure they followed. Remarkable spatial awareness, Jenny noted reluctantly, recording observations on her tablet. She's not just running blind, she's leading us somewhere specific. Brahmin cattle are smarter than people give them credit for, Mike said, navigating the Jeep over a particularly rough section, especially the mothers. Frank peered at the cow through binoculars. She's lactating. Has to be a calf involved. The words hung heavy in the humid air. All three knew what that likely meant. Predation? Jenny asked. Possible, Mike answered. Jaguar maybe, though they don't usually take on something as large as a Brahmin calf if other prey is available. Frank shook his head. Something's not right. This isn't normal behavior, even for a distressed mother. The terrain grew more challenging as they ventured deeper into the forest. Twice they had to stop to clear fallen branches from their path. Each time the cow became increasingly agitated, pacing and making low, mournful sounds that raised the hair on the back of Mike's neck. We've crossed into the Northern Conservation Zone, Jenny announced, checking GPS coordinates. We're officially outside our patrol jurisdiction. Noted, Mike said without slowing. The radio crackled to life with Director Reynolds' voice. Station to Harrison. We show your vehicle outside designated zone. Report status immediately. Mike exchanged glances with Frank, who reached over and switched off the radio. That's another protocol violation, Jenny said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. Add it to your report, Mike replied. The cow stopped abruptly at the edge of a small clearing, her entire body trembling. She turned to the humans, her eyes wide with what Mike could only interpret as desperation, then let out a bellow that echoed through the trees. There, Frank pointed toward a dark mass on the far side of the clearing. Mike felt his heart sink. Even from a distance, he could see the swarming movement, the undulating mass of small, dark bodies. As they approached, the horror of the scene became clear. Hundreds of vampire bats covered a small, copper-colored calf, so numerous they appeared as a single writhing organism. Desmodus rotundus, Jenny whispered, her scientific detachment momentarily overcoming shock. Common vampire bat, but I've never seen them swarm like this. The mother cow pawed the ground in distress, making aborted charging movements toward the mass of bats, only to pull back as they scattered temporarily before reforming. "She's been trying to save her calf," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's why she's cut up. She's been charging into them." Mike was already unloading equipment. "Frank, get the lights set up." "Jenny, there's a tranquilizer kit in the red case. Small dose, we just need to calm the mother so she doesn't hurt herself or us." To his surprise, Jenny moved without argument, retrieving the kit with efficient movements. "What's your plan?" she asked. "Vampire bats navigate largely through echolocation. Bright lights disorient them," Mike explained, pulling on thick protective gloves. "We'll try to scatter them long enough to extract the calf." Frank positioned the powerful LED arrays while Mike prepared to approach the swarm. "This is insane," Jenny said, loading the tranquilizer dart. "That calf could already be dead. And even if it's not, this is exactly the kind of invasive species we're supposed to be controlling, not saving." Mike paused, looking at her directly. "Do you have pets, Dr. Thompson?" The question caught her off guard. "A cat? What is that? Is your cat native to this ecosystem?" She fell silent. "Where do we draw the line, Jenny?" Mike asked quietly. "Who gets to decide which lives matter? That mother came to us? To humans? For help. What does that tell you?" Before she could answer, the cow let out another mournful bellow, her eyes fixed on her suffering calf. "Ready with the lights," Frank called. Mike turned to Jenny. "Last chance to stay with the protocol." Jenny stared at the desperate mother cow, then at the calf being slowly drained of life. Something shifted in her expression. "The lights won't be enough," she said finally. "We'll need to create a perimeter with repellent too. I have experimental bat deterrent in my research kit." Mike nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Welcome to the other side of the clipboard, Dr. Thompson." The radio crackled again with Director Reynolds' increasingly angry demands for response. None of them moved to answer it. Instead, they prepared for the rescue, working with the quiet efficiency of people who had made their choice. Protocol be damned. The mother cow watched them, her large brown eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that transcended the supposed boundaries between human and animal. In that moment, Mike recognized something in her that he had seen countless times during his years as a veterinarian, not just instinct but love. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own losses lighten just a fraction. Some things were worth fighting for, even if victory wasn't guaranteed. Some connections mattered more than rules. "All right," he said, facing the terrible scene before them. "Let's bring this calf home." The first attempt to disperse the bats failed spectacularly. When Frank activated the high-powered LED arrays, the bats scattered momentarily, a writhing black cloud lifting from the calf's body, only to reform seconds later, their collective hunger stronger than their disorientation. "They're adapting quickly," Jenny observed, the scientist in her momentarily overriding her disgust. "I've never seen this behavior in vampire bats. They typically feed individually or in small groups." Mike approached cautiously, protective gear covering every inch of exposed skin. Even from 10 feet away, he could see the calf was in dire condition, its copper hide barely visible beneath streaks of blood, its small chest heaving with labored breaths. "The drought must have forced them to change feeding strategies," Frank suggested, adjusting the light angle. "Desperate times. Whatever the reason, we need a new plan," Mike said. The mother cow paced anxiously nearby, her eyes never leaving her calf. "That little one doesn't have much time left." As if confirming his assessment, dark clouds began gathering overhead, not bats this time, but an afternoon storm brewing. In the Amazon, such storms could transform from sprinkles to deluge in minutes. "Weather's turning," Frank noted, glancing skyward. "If we're going to do this, we need to move fast." Jenny returned to the Jeep, rummaging through her research equipment. "I have ultrasonic deterrent devices, experimental models. They emit frequencies that should disrupt their echolocation more effectively than lights alone. The radio crackled to life again, Director Reynolds' voice cutting through the humid air with unmistakable authority. Harrison, Williams, Thompson, return to station immediately. That's a direct order. We have confirmed flash flood warnings for your sector. Repeat, return immediately. Mike and Frank exchanged glances. They'd both worked in the Amazon long enough to respect the deadly potential of flash floods. "We should go," Jenny said, though her voice lacked conviction as she looked at the suffering calf. The mother cow sensed their hesitation. She approached Mike directly, stopping just feet away. Her massive frame could easily have crushed him, yet there was an almost supplicating quality to her posture as she lowered her head, then looked meaningfully toward her calf. "I've never," Jenny began, then stopped. "This isn't normal bovine behavior." "No," Mike agreed quietly. "It's not." The radio demanded their attention again. "Harrison, this is your final warning. Return now or face termination. We cannot spare resources for rescue if you're caught in a flood zone." Mike unclipped the radio from his belt, held it for a long moment, then handed it to Jenny. "Your call, Dr. Thompson. By the book or by conscience?" Thunder rumbled in the distance. The calf's breathing grew more labored. And Jenny looked at the radio, then at the desperate mother and dying calf. Something shifted in her expression, the rigid adherence to protocol giving way to something more fundamental. "The book doesn't cover this," she said finally, pocketing the radio without responding to Reynolds. "Let's try the ultrasonic devices." The new approach showed more promise. When activated, the ultrasonic emitters caused greater disruption among the bats. They scattered in chaotic patterns, their echolocation confused by the competing signals. But still, their hunger drove them back toward the weakened calf. "It's not enough," Frank said, frustration evident in his voice. "We need something more powerful." Mike stood silently, thinking. Rain began to fall, light drops at first but quickly intensifying. Time was running out on multiple fronts. "There's a logging operation 10 miles north," he said suddenly. "They have industrial floodlights for night work, the kind powered by generators. Bright enough to turn night into day." "That's private property," Jenny objected, then caught herself. "Though I suppose we're well past worrying about that." "The lights we have aren't strong enough," Mike continued, "but those would be. Problem is, even if they'd lend them to us, we couldn't get them here in time." He paused, looking at the increasingly heavy rainfall. "Unless—" "Unless what?" Frank asked. "Unless we get a helicopter." The silence that followed was broken only by the pattering of rain and the distressed lowing of the mother cow. "A helicopter," Jenny repeated flatly. "During a developing storm, to save a non-native calf. The department would never—" "Not the department," Mike interrupted. "Private charter. I know a guy in Manaus who flies for the tourism companies." Frank stared at his friend. "Mike, that would cost—" "Most of my retirement fund," Mike finished for him. "I know." The absurdity of it hung in the air between them. Trading financial security for a dying calf that, by conservation standards, shouldn't even be there. "You'd do that?" Jenny asked quietly. "For an invasive species?" Mike looked at the mother cow, still standing vigilant despite her exhaustion and wounds. "When my farm failed, after the cattle destroyed everything, I sat on my porch with a bottle of whiskey and my service revolver. Couldn't see any way forward." His voice remained steady, though the memory clearly wasn't. "My neighbor's dog kept barking, wouldn't stop. Finally came over to see what was wrong. Found the old man had fallen, been down for 2 days. He turned to Jenny, his weathered face solemn. "That dog saved 2 lives that day. Never asked what species I was, never checked if I was native to the ecosystem, just knew someone needed help." Rain fell harder now, plastering their clothes to their bodies. The bats continued their feeding frenzy, seemingly undeterred by the downpour. "I'm calling for that helicopter," Mike said, pulling out his cell phone. "You two can head back if you want. No sense in all of us risking our jobs." Frank stepped forward, placing a hand on Mike's shoulder. "Split it with you," he said simply. "Half and half." Mike's expression softened momentarily. "Frank, you've got grandkids heading to college, and they're going to learn that some things matter more than money," Frank replied firmly. "Make the call." Both men turned to Jenny, expecting her objection. Instead, she was crouched near her equipment, assembling something with rapid, precise movements. "The helicopter will take at least 40 minutes to reach us," she said without looking up. "I'm modifying these emitters to create a temporary perimeter. It won't drive them off completely, but it might keep them from feeding so aggressively until help arrives." She paused, meeting Mike's surprised gaze. "What? This isn't about the protocol anymore. This is—" She gestured toward the mother cow, who hadn't moved from her vigilant position. "This is about something else." As Mike made the call, arranging for an emergency pickup of industrial lights and their delivery to the clearing, he felt something shift inside him. A door, long closed, creaking open just a fraction. For 20 years, he'd done the job, followed the rules, kept his head down, and his heart guarded. Retirement had loomed as nothing more than an end, not a beginning. Now, watching Jenny and Frank work together to create a protective barrier around the suffering calf, seeing the mother cow's unwavering vigilance, he recognized what had changed. This wasn't just about saving a calf. This was about remembering why saving anything mattered at all. 40 minutes, he announced, rejoining them. "Weather's making it tricky, but they're coming." The rain intensified, turning the clearing into a muddy morass. They worked in grim silence, fighting deteriorating conditions and the relentless feeding behavior of the bats. "This isn't just about hunger," Jenny said as they waited, her scientific curiosity returning. "This many bats concentrated on one prey, it's unprecedented. Something else is driving this behavior." "Does it matter why?" Frank asked, adjusting the makeshift barriers they'd created. "It might," she replied. "If we understand why they're so fixated, we might find a better way to drive them off." In the distance, the faint thrum of helicopter blades grew gradually louder, fighting against the storm winds. A small victory, but significant. Help was coming. The mother cow, hearing the approaching aircraft, grew agitated. Mike approached her carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones. "It's all right, girl. Help's coming. Just hold on a little longer." To the amazement of both Frank and Jenny, the massive animal calmed at his words, her desperate eyes fixed on his as though understanding every syllable. "I've never seen anything like it," Jenny murmured. "The level of trust she's placing in humans." "Not in humans," Frank corrected quietly. "In Mike." The moment crystallized something Mike had felt stirring since the cow first appeared at the ranger station, a connection that transcended species, a recognition between two beings who had both known loss and desperate hope. In her eyes, he saw not just animal instinct, but something profound. Faith. "We're not going to let you down," he promised, both to the cow and to himself. "Not this time." As the helicopter approached, fighting through worsening weather, Mike stood straighter than he had in years. This wasn't just a turning point for the dying calf. It was a turning point for him as well. A choice to believe again that actions mattered, that compassion wasn't wasted, that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The storm raged overhead, but for the first time in decades, Mike Harrison felt the quiet clearing of inner clouds, a break in a much longer drought than the one currently afflicting the Amazon. Whatever happened next, something essential had already been rescued. The helicopter descended through sheets of rain, its rotors battling the intensifying storm. The pilot, a weathered local named Cardoso, whom Mike had known for years, expertly maneuvered the aircraft into the clearing. Strapped to its underside was a cargo net containing 4 industrial floodlights, each powerful enough to illuminate a football field. "Your retirement looks expensive, old man," Cardoso shouted over the roar of the engine once they'd unloaded the equipment. He cast a dubious glance at the scene: 3 soaked rangers, a massive Brahman cow, and a writhing black mass of bats in the distance. "This better be worth it," Mike nodded grimly. "It is. Get yourself clear. Storm's getting worse." As the helicopter lifted away, they worked with desperate efficiency to position the generator and connect the massive lights. The mother cow watched their every move, her huge frame trembling with exhaustion and hope. "Generators ready?" Frank called, giving the starter cord a powerful pull. The machine roared to life, sputtering briefly before settling into a steady rhythm. "Lights positioned," Jenny confirmed, ankle-deep in mud. The transformation from by-the-book biologist to mud-covered rescuer was complete. "Ready on your mark." Mike surveyed their setup. They had arranged the 4 floodlights in a semicircle around the calf, each angled to create maximum illumination without shadows. The ultrasonic emitters Jenny had modified formed a secondary perimeter. "All at once," Mike instructed. "Ready? Now." The clearing exploded with light so intense it seemed to push back the storm itself. The effect on the bats was immediate and dramatic. The black mass dissolved into hundreds of individual creatures, their feeding frenzy disrupted by the sudden artificial day. They scattered in confusion, their echolocation systems overwhelmed by both the lights and Jenny's emitters. "It's working!" Frank shouted over the storm. The mother cow needed no further invitation. She charged forward toward her calf, her powerful form parting the remaining bats like a ship through water. Mike followed close behind, medical kit in hand, protective gear shielding him from any bats that might strike in confusion. What they found beneath the dispersing swarm stopped them cold. The calf, no more than a few days old, Mike estimated, lay in a pool of blood-soaked mud, its copper coat matted and dark. Its sides heaved with shallow, rapid breaths. But it was the extent of the feeding that shocked them. Hundreds of small wounds covered the calf's body, each precisely placed to maximize blood flow without hitting major arteries, a testament to the vampire bat's feeding efficiency. "My God," Jenny whispered, arriving beside them. "How is it still alive?" The mother cow gently nudged her calf with her muzzle, making soft, lowing sounds that cut through the storm's noise with their naked emotion. The calf responded with a weak movement, its eyes fluttering but not opening. "We need to stabilize it here before moving it," Mike said, already opening his medical kit. "Frank, keep those lights running no matter what. Jenny, I need an IV line established, fluids and broad-spectrum antibiotics." "I'm not a veterinarian," Jenny protested. "Today you are," Mike replied, not looking up from his examination of the calf. "You've done field medicine on research animals. Same principle." As they worked to stabilize the critically wounded calf, the storm intensified. Thunder crashed overhead and lightning split the sky. The floodlights flickered ominously. "Generator's struggling," Frank called out, hunched protectively over the machine. "Fuel's good, but it's getting swamped." "Keep it running," Mike ordered, his hands steady as he cleaned wounds and applied pressure bandages. "Those bats are still circling. Moment these lights go out, they'll be back." The mother cow stood guard, her massive body positioned between the injured calf and the darkness beyond the light's reach. Occasionally, she would turn to watch Mike work, her large eyes reflecting an understanding that seemed impossible for a bovine. "Fluids are running," Jenny reported, having successfully established an IV line. She paused, her scientific curiosity evident despite the crisis. "The bite patterns are unusual. They're clustered in specific regions, almost like they were working together." "Coordinated feeding," Mike confirmed grimly. "Seen it once before years ago during another severe drought." When resources are scarce, they adapt. A particularly violent gust of wind rocked the clearing, and one of the floodlights toppled, shattering as it hit the ground. Immediately, a portion of their protective light barrier disappeared. "We're losing the perimeter!" Frank shouted. As if sensing the opportunity, the bats began to gather more densely at the edge of the remaining light, their small forms creating an undulating dark wall just beyond reach. "We need to move him now," Mike decided, quickly assessing the calf's condition. "He's stable enough for transport. Frank, back the jeep up as close as you can get." "The mud's too deep," Frank replied, already trying. "Wheels are spinning." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Another floodlight flickered and died as water reached its electrical components. Their safe zone was shrinking by the minute. Then came the sound they'd been dreading. The generator coughed, sputtered, and despite Frank's desperate efforts, died with a final mechanical wheeze. "No, no, no!" Frank pounded on the machine, trying to restart it as the remaining lights dimmed and went dark. Darkness fell over the clearing, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. In those brief illuminations, they could see the bats regrouping, preparing to reclaim their prey. "New plan," Mike said, his voice steady despite the crisis. "We form a human shield around the calf. The mother, too. She's wounded, and they might target her next." "A human shield?" Jenny's voice held disbelief. "Against hundreds of vampire bats?" "They're opportunistic feeders," Mike explained, already positioning himself. "They prefer defenseless prey. If we make ourselves big, loud, and threatening, they may hold back long enough for us to figure something out." It was a desperate strategy, but the only one available. They formed a tight circle around the calf and its mother, their backs to the animals, faces toward the gathering darkness. Each held whatever they could use as a deterrent. Jenny with her tablet screen's light, Frank with a flashlight, Mike with a battery-powered lantern from the medical kit. The bats began testing their defenses almost immediately, diving close before veering away, searching for weakness in their protective formation. "Keep moving, keep making noise," Mike instructed. "Don't let them find a pattern." They shouted, waved their lights, and maintained their protective circle as the storm raged and the bats probed. It was a primal scene. Humans using their most ancient defenses against a predator that had evolved alongside them for millennia. In the chaos, Jenny's scientific mind continued working. "This behavior, it's remarkable," she shouted over the storm. "They're not just feeding randomly. They're systematically—" She broke off as a bat dove particularly close to her face. "They're targeting specific areas, almost like they're harvesting." "Worry about the dissertation later," Frank called back, swinging his flashlight at a cluster of bats that had ventured too close. The mother cow, seemingly understanding their protective intent, had positioned herself over her calf, creating a secondary shield with her massive body. She would occasionally swing her horned head toward approaching bats, sending them scattering momentarily. Lightning revealed their predicament in stark relief. 3 humans and 2 cattle surrounded by a living cloud of hungry predators, all trapped in a worsening storm. Their position was unsustainable. Then, miraculously, distant lights appeared through the trees, headlights approaching rapidly along the muddy track. "Someone's coming!" Frank shouted. The vehicle that emerged into the clearing was a department SUV, its heavy-duty frame better suited to the deepening mud than their Jeep had been. Behind the wheel was the last person they expected to see, Dr. Eleanor Carter, the regional wildlife veterinarian, accompanied by 2 assistant rangers. "Harrison," she called through the open window, "Reynolds sent me to drag you back. What in God's name is happening here?" "Bat attack on a calf," Mike shouted back. "We need lights. Now." Dr. Carter, a practical woman in her 60s who had treated everything from jaguars to anacondas in her long career, assessed the situation with remarkable speed. Within minutes, she had her team setting up emergency lights from her vehicle and deploying specialized equipment from her veterinary kit. Portable operating theater, she explained as a collapsible tent structure took shape, illuminated by powerful battery-operated lights. Use it for field surgeries on large animals. The additional lights and human presence further disrupted the bats' feeding attempts. With the new defensive perimeter established, they were able to carefully move the calf into Dr. Carter's treatment tent. "Never seen anything like this," Dr. Carter murmured as she examined the extensive feeding wounds. "The pattern is unusual," Jenny nodded eagerly. "That's what I was noticing. They're not just feeding randomly. The bite patterns show a systematic approach, almost like they're performing a procedure," Dr. Carter finished, her experienced eyes narrowing as she cleaned a particularly clustered set of bites. "These groupings aren't accidental." Mike, assisting with the emergency treatment, found himself watching the mother cow, who had refused to leave the tent despite the cramped conditions. She stood vigilant, her eyes fixed on her calf, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to calm the young animal. "She adopted him," Mike said suddenly, the realization striking him as he observed subtle differences between the two animals. "Look at the markings. That's not her biological calf." Dr. Carter glanced up from her work, then studied both animals more carefully. "You're right. Different markings entirely. She's a silver-gray Brahmin. This calf has distinct copper coloration, different bloodline altogether." "An adopted calf," Jenny breathed, the significance not lost on her. "She's risking her life for an infant that isn't even hers." The discovery added another layer to the already extraordinary situation. As they worked to stabilize the calf, treating its numerous wounds and administering blood substitutes to replace what it had lost, the storm gradually began to subside. Outside, the assistant rangers reported that the bats were finally dispersing as natural dawn approached. "He's going to need ongoing treatment, Doctor," Carter concluded after they'd done everything possible in the field. "But I think he'll survive. These Brahmin calves are remarkably resilient." "Where will you take them?" Mike asked, the question heavy with implication. Before Dr. Carter could answer, another vehicle approached, this one unmistakably the director's personal transport. Reynolds had come himself. "That," Dr. Carter said grimly, "is a conversation we're about to have." The mother cow, as if sensing the new threat, moved protectively closer to her calf, her eyes never leaving the tent entrance where Director Reynolds would soon appear. Mike found himself doing the same, instinctively positioning himself between the animals and the approaching administrator. Some battles were fought with medicine and lights. Others would be fought with words and principles. Either way, he was prepared to stand his ground. "Thank you," he said quietly to Dr. Carter and the others, "for coming, for helping." "Some things transcend protocol," Dr. Carter replied simply, echoing his earlier sentiment to Jenny. "Always have, always will." Outside, Director Reynolds' car door slammed shut. The next battle was about to begin. Director Thomas Reynolds entered the makeshift treatment tent like a gathering storm, his tall frame rigid with controlled fury, silver hair plastered to his forehead by rain, and eyes cold as he surveyed the scene before him. At 55, Reynolds had built his career on unwavering adherence to conservation protocols, rising through bureaucratic ranks with methodical precision. 3 staff members, department resources, and a privately chartered helicopter, he began, his voice deceptively quiet. All deployed without authorization during a severe weather event that put human lives at risk. All for this. He gestured dismissively toward the wounded calf and its protective mother. Mike straightened to his full height, mud-splattered and exhausted but unbowed. The situation required immediate action. "The situation," Reynolds countered, required following established protocol for invasive species management. Not a rescue mission that endangered staff and diverted resources from legitimate conservation priorities. The tension in the tent was palpable. Dr. Carter continued working on the calf, her focus deliberately maintained on her patient rather than the confrontation unfolding. "With respect, Director," Jenny interjected, surprising everyone, "this case presents unique research opportunities. The bat behavior we witnessed was unprecedented. Coordinated feeding patterns that suggest complex social structures previously undocumented in Desmodus rotundus." Reynolds turned his cold gaze toward her. "Dr. Thompson, I expected better from you given your published work on invasive species impact. You've compromised years of professional standing for what? Sentimental attachment to livestock?" Jenny flushed but held her ground. "For science that doesn't fit neatly into our preconceptions. The feeding patterns these bats displayed weren't random. They were systematic, almost surgical." "Save the research justifications," Reynolds dismissed. "This was a clear violation of department policy regarding resource allocation and invasive species management." He turned back to Mike. "Harrison, you directly disobeyed multiple orders to return to station. You're suspended pending formal termination proceedings." Frank stepped forward. "If Mike goes, I go too." "That can be arranged, Williams." The mother cow shifted restlessly, drawing Reynolds' attention. For a moment, man and animal locked eyes, one representing institutional authority, the other a more primal power. The cow's massive frame seemed to expand as she positioned herself more firmly between the humans and her calf. "The helicopter was privately funded," Mike said quietly. "My retirement savings and Frank's, no department resources were misappropriated there." "You think that matters?" Reynolds asked incredulously. "You abandoned your post during an emergency, took a department vehicle off route without authorization, and diverted Dr. Carter from her scheduled duties." "I diverted myself," Dr. Carter interjected without looking up from her work. "Medical judgment call. The treatment protocols for this situation are fascinating, Tom. Something we've never documented before." Outside the tent, the storm was finally passing. Dawn light filtered through the canvas, illuminating the scene in soft gold, the wounded calf breathing more steadily now, the vigilant mother, the mud-splattered rangers standing their ground. "The department has clear policies," Reynolds began. "The department wasn't there," Mike interrupted, his voice steady. "We were standing right where that cow is now, watching her calf being consumed alive. You want to talk about policies? Fine. But first, tell me what you would have done if you'd been in my boots." "If you'd looked that mother in the eyes and seen what I saw." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Emotional appeals don't change protocol." "Maybe they should," Jenny said softly. "Maybe protocols need to evolve based on what we learn in the field. Isn't that the foundation of good science?" The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. One of the assistant rangers stuck his head into the tent. "Director, there's media. Someone tipped them off." Reynolds' expression darkened further. "Keep them back. This is a restricted area." "Too late," the ranger replied apologetically. "They're already filming. Got here by boat when the road was blocked. They've been documenting the whole rescue operation from the tree line." The dynamics shifted instantly. Reynolds was a career administrator who understood political realities as well as conservation principles. Public perception could make or break funding allocations. "What exactly have they captured?" he asked tightly. "Everything," the ranger admitted. "The bat attack, the rescue efforts, the mother cow leading you here. It's already streaming live on several platforms." Through the tent opening, they could see camera crews positioning equipment at a respectful distance, capturing footage of the extraordinary scene. The sun, now fully risen, illuminated the aftermath of their night-long struggle. Muddy equipment scattered around the clearing, the protective circle of lights, the massive mother cow standing guard over her adopted calf. "This changes nothing about the protocol violation," Reynolds insisted, though his tone had moderated slightly. Mike stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Tom, I've given 30 years to this department. Never asked for special treatment, never bucked the system. But some things matter more than rules. That cow came to humans for help. She recognized intelligence in another species and trusted us to understand her need. If that's not worth bending a protocol for, I don't know what is." Reynolds maintained his rigid posture, but something flickered in his eyes, a momentary crack in the administrative armor. Dr. Carter chose this moment to deliver her clinical assessment. "The calf is stabilizing, but requires ongoing treatment. The feeding pattern of the bats is unlike anything previously documented. They appear to have targeted specific areas while avoiding major arteries, almost as if they were harvesting rather than simply feeding." "Harvesting?" Reynolds couldn't hide his scientific curiosity. "The bite patterns show a systematic approach," Dr. Carter continued, gesturing for him to observe the wounds she'd cleaned and dressed. "See these clusters? They're concentrated around lymph nodes and minor blood vessels, not the jugular or femoral arteries where you'd expect maximum blood flow." Jenny moved closer, her scientific interest fully engaged. "It's like they were performing a controlled extraction rather than predation." Even Reynolds couldn't resist examining the evidence before him. "That doesn't match known feeding behaviors for Desmodus rotundus." "Exactly," Dr. Carter agreed, "which is why this case merits further study rather than simply eliminating the animals as invasive species." Outside, the cameras continued rolling. The story was already taking shape beyond their control, dedicated rangers risking everything to save a helpless calf and its adoptive mother during a violent storm. The narrative was powerful, emotional, and spreading by the second. "I'm getting calls from headquarters," one of the assistant rangers reported, holding up a satellite phone. "The footage is going viral. They want a statement." Reynolds closed his eyes briefly, recalibrating. When he spoke again, his voice carried the careful tone of a man reassessing his position. "Dr. Carter, what's required for proper treatment of these animals? Transportation to our medical facility, blood transfusions for the calf, wound management, nutritional support," she replied promptly. "And permission to document this unprecedented behavioral pattern in both the bats and the maternal behavior of the cow." Reynolds nodded slowly. "And you believe this case presents legitimate scientific interest beyond standard livestock predation?" "Without question," Dr. Carter confirmed. "What we're seeing here could change our understanding of both vampire bat social structures and bovine cognition." The political calculation was visible on Reynolds' face, weighing career advancement against public relations, scientific discovery against procedural adherence. "Harrison," he said finally, "this doesn't erase your insubordination. But in light of unique research opportunities presented by this case, I'm postponing any disciplinary action pending review." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was space to breathe. Mike nodded, accepting the temporary reprieve. "Dr. Thompson," Reynolds continued, turning to Jenny, "I expect a comprehensive research proposal on my desk detailing exactly what scientific value can be derived from this incident." "Already outlining it in my head, sir," Jenny replied, a hint of triumph in her voice. "Williams, coordinate transport of these animals to the medical facility," Reynolds instructed Frank. "Dr. Carter, you'll oversee treatment and documentation." With rapid efficiency, Reynolds had transformed a protocol violation into a research initiative, the hallmark of a skilled administrator adapting to changing circumstances. As preparations began for transporting the animals, Mike found himself standing alone with the mother cow. She regarded him steadily, her large eyes reflecting an intelligence that transcended simplistic notions of animal cognition. "You know what you did, don't you?" he said quietly to her. "You changed the rules of engagement. Made us see you." The cow lowered her massive head, gently nudging his arm in what felt remarkably like acknowledgement. Media representatives called questions from beyond the perimeter. Cameras captured the tender interaction between ranger and cow, and somewhere in the digital world, a story was unfolding that would challenge preconceptions about the boundaries between species. The transportation team arrived with a specialized livestock trailer. Moving the injured calf would be delicate work, requiring both medical care and managing the mother's protective instincts. "She won't let us move him without her," Dr. Carter observed as the mother cow positioned herself firmly beside the makeshift stretcher. "Then we take them both," Mike decided. Together, as they carefully loaded both animals, ensuring the mother could maintain visual contact with her calf during transport, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the profound satisfaction of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. Protocol be damned. The media documented every moment of the loading process, capturing the extraordinary bond between the animals and the careful attention of the rangers. When a reporter called out asking why so much effort was being made for non-native livestock, it was Jenny who responded. "Because sometimes conservation isn't just about what belongs where according to human boundaries," she called back. "Sometimes it's about recognizing intelligence, adaptation, and bonds that transcend our categories." Reynolds winced slightly at this departure from official policy, but made no move to contradict her. The narrative was already established: compassionate science overcoming rigid bureaucracy, dedicated rangers recognizing something profound in an animal's plea for help. As the transport convoy prepared to depart, Mike found himself face to face with Reynolds away from the cameras. "This isn't over, Harrison," the director said quietly. "When the media attention fades, there will be consequences." Mike nodded, unintimidated. "Probably will be. But today, we did the right thing. Sometimes that's enough." "Is it?" Reynolds asked. "When it potentially compromises the entire ecosystem management approach we've spent decades developing?" "Maybe the approach needs re-examining," Mike suggested. "Maybe recognizing intelligence and adaptability in other species isn't sentimentality. Maybe it's better science." Before Reynolds could respond, Dr. Carter called for Mike's assistance. The calf had become agitated during loading, and only the mother cow's presence was keeping it calm. Mike's connection with both animals seemed to have a stabilizing effect. As he moved away, Mike caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the transport vehicle's window, mud-streaked, exhausted, yet somehow more alive than he'd felt in years. Whether his career survived this incident or not, he had rediscovered something essential about why he'd become a ranger in the first place. The convoy finally departed, carrying its unusual patients toward the medical facility. The media followed, capturing footage of the remarkable procession, science, compassion, and controversy traveling together down the muddy Amazon road. In the transport vehicle, Mike sat beside the mother cow, his hand resting lightly on her massive shoulder. Her attention remained fixed on her calf, but there was an awareness of his presence, a connection forged through crisis and mutual purpose. "You're going to be famous, old girl," he told her softly. "Might just change how people think about your kind." Whether she understood his words or merely his tone, the cow leaned slightly into his touch, a gesture that bridged the supposed gulf between human and animal minds more eloquently than any scientific paper ever could. What had begun as a protocol violation was transforming into something far more significant, a moment that challenged fundamental assumptions about species boundaries, animal cognition, and the proper relationship between humans and the natural world they claim to protect. And for Mike Harrison, 2 months from retirement, it was something else entirely. a reminder that the most important protocols weren't written in department manuals, but in the deeper recognition of life's intrinsic value regardless of origin or category. As the medical facility came into view, he felt a quiet certainty that whatever consequences awaited him professionally, he had already received the greater reward, the restoration of purpose that comes from standing one's ground for something that matters. The mother cow shifted slightly, her warm bulk solid against his side. Together they watched over the wounded calf, two protectors united across the supposed divide of species, a living embodiment of the truth that compassion recognizes no boundaries. By the third day at the medical facility, hope began to fade. Despite Dr. Carter's expertise and round-the-clock care, the calf, now named Rusty by the staff, showed alarming signs of decline. His initially stable vital signs deteriorated, his breathing grew increasingly labored, and the wounds that had seemed to be healing began to show signs of infection. "I don't understand it," Dr. Carter confessed, reviewing the latest blood work with Mike and Jenny in the small conference room adjacent to the treatment area. "We've administered appropriate antibiotics, blood transfusions, fluids, everything by the book, but it's like his system is shutting down despite our interventions." Mike stared through the observation window at the treatment stall where Rusty lay on a bed of clean straw, various monitoring equipment attached to his small body. The mother cow, whom they'd named Stella, hadn't left his side, refusing food and water unless brought directly to her position beside her adopted calf. "Could it be something related to the bat bites?" Jenny suggested, her scientific mind still processing the unusual feeding patterns they'd observed. "Some kind of toxin or pathogen we haven't identified?" Dr. Carter sighed heavily. "We've tested for everything in our database. Nothing unusual is showing up except..." "Except what?" Mike prompted when she hesitated. "There's something strange in his blood chemistry. Compounds I can't identify. I've sent samples to the university lab in Manaus, but results won't come back for at least another day." Outside in the corridor, the facility staff moved with the subdued efficiency of people who recognize the approaching shadow of failure. The case had captured international attention, the Amazon rescue becoming a viral sensation with millions following updates on the calf's condition. And reporters camped outside the facility waiting for news. Mike received the official termination letter that morning. It arrived without ceremony, a department courier delivering the envelope with awkward sympathy. Reynolds had made good on his threat once the initial media furor had begun to subside. 30 years of service ended with a 3-paragraph letter citing multiple protocol violations and insubordination. Frank had received a final written warning rather than termination, his decades of service and proximity to retirement apparently earning him a lesser punishment. Jenny had escaped official sanction entirely, her status as a research scientist and quick thinking in framing the incident as a scientific opportunity providing sufficient cover. "Mike," Dr. Carter said gently, drawing him back from his thoughts, "you should get some rest. You've been here for 72 hours straight." He shook his head, eyes still fixed on the failing calf and his vigilant mother. "I'm not leaving them." The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. He had sacrificed his career for these animals. Leaving now when the end seemed near was unthinkable. Jenny cleared her throat. "There's something else we need to discuss. The media narrative is shifting. Conservation hardliners are gaining traction with arguments about resource misallocation and sentimentality, undermining scientific management." "Let them talk," Mike said dismissively. "It's more than talk," Jenny persisted. "There's growing pressure from certain department heads to euthanize Rusty if his condition doesn't improve by tomorrow. They're framing it as the humane option, while simultaneously using it to reinforce the narrative that the rescue was misguided from the start." Mike's jaw tightened. "Over my dead body." "You don't have standing anymore," Dr. Carter reminded him gently. As of this morning, you're not department personnel. Your access to this facility is only courtesy." The reality of his situation hit Mike with renewed force. He had given everything to save these animals, and now he might be powerless to protect them from a system that viewed them as invasive pests rather than beings worthy of compassion. "There has to be something we're missing," he insisted, changing the subject back to Rusty's treatment. "Something about those bat bites, the feeding pattern." Before either woman could respond, a commotion erupted in the treatment area. Stella had suddenly risen to her feet, making distressed vocalizations unlike anything they'd heard from her before. Rusty's monitoring equipment was sounding alarms. They rushed into the treatment stall to find Rusty convulsing, his small body racked with spasms. Stella paced in agitation, periodically nudging her calf with desperate gentleness. "He's crashing," Dr. Carter announced, immediately administering emergency medications. "Heart rate's plummeting, oxygen saturation dropping." Mike moved to Stella, attempting to calm her while the medical team worked frantically on Rusty. The massive cow leaned into him with surprising trust, her enormous frame trembling with what could only be described as grief. "Don't give up, girl," he whispered to her. "Don't give up on him yet." For nearly an hour, Dr. Carter and her team fought to stabilize Rusty, employing every medical intervention available. Mike and Jenny kept Stella calm throughout the crisis, speaking soothingly and ensuring she could still see her calf without interfering with the medical procedures. Finally, Dr. Carter stepped back, her face drawn with defeat. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "We've done everything possible." The monitoring equipment was silenced, its alarms no longer necessary. Rusty lay motionless on the straw, his copper coat dulled by illness, his small chest still. Stella seemed to understand immediately. She pushed past Mike with gentle insistence, approaching her calf and lowering her massive head to nuzzle him. The sound she made, a deep, resonant lowing that seemed to come from some place beyond ordinary animal vocalization, filled the treatment stall with raw grief. The medical team quietly withdrew, leaving Mike, Jenny, and Dr. Carter to witness Stella's mourning. None of them spoke. No words seemed adequate for the moment. Mike felt the weight of failure pressing down on him with crushing force. His career was gone. The calf he had sacrificed it for was dead. And Stella, intelligent, trusting Stella, had lost the child she had fought so desperately to protect. News of Rusty's death spread quickly. Media outlets updated their stories. Conservation hardliners pointed to the outcome as evidence of misplaced priorities. And social media erupted with both heartfelt condolences and critical commentaries on resource allocation. Director Reynolds issued a statement that managed to express regret while simultaneously vindicating the department's protocols. "While we mourn the loss of the animal, this outcome underscores the importance of established conservation protocols that prioritize native species protection over individual rescue attempts, however well-intentioned." The university lab called with the blood test results, but they seemed irrelevant now. Academic findings about a battle already lost. Dr. Carter listened briefly before thanking them and hanging up, her scientific curiosity temporarily overshadowed by the emotional weight of their failure. By evening, Mike sat alone with Stella in the treatment stall, the facility staff having granted this final courtesy before preparations would begin for removing Rusty's body. The mother cow had not eaten or drunk anything since her calf's death, despite gentle attempts to coax her. "I'm sorry, old girl," Mike said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I could save him for you. I thought—" He trailed off, the futility of explanation apparent even to himself. Stella stood motionless beside her calf's body, her massive form a sculpture of grief. Frank arrived shortly after sunset, having driven directly from the ranger station after his shift. He entered the treatment stall quietly, placing a supportive hand on Mike's shoulder. "Heard the news," he said simply. "Came as soon as I could." Mike nodded, grateful for his friend's presence. "What happens now?" Frank asked after a respectful silence. "They'll remove him in the morning," Mike replied, the words painful to speak. "Stella will be assessed for release or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Frank understood the unspoken alternative, euthanasia as the humane option for an invasive species with no habitat to return to. "The public might have something to say about that," Frank commented. "This story's touched people." "There's a donation page set up for your legal fees that's raised over $30,000 in 2 days." Mike looked up in surprise. "What legal fees?" "To fight your termination," Frank explained. "Some environmental law firm offered to take your case pro bono after seeing the footage. And there's a petition with over 100,000 signatures demanding Stella be protected." The information barely penetrated Mike's exhaustion and grief. Whatever public support existed seemed hollow in the face of Rusty's still form and Stella's silent mourning. Dr. Carter entered, her face showing the strain of the past days. "Mike, Frank," she acknowledged, then hesitated as if struggling with what to say next. "Just tell us straight," Mike requested. "The department's sending a representative tomorrow morning," she said. "They want to collect tissue samples from Rusty before final disposition of the remains. And they'll make a determination about Stella." "Meaning they'll decide whether to kill her too," Mike translated bitterly. Dr. Carter didn't deny it. "I've argued for sanctuary placement, but as an invasive species—" She left the rest unsaid. The three fell silent, watching Stella maintain her vigil over her calf. The massive cow occasionally shifted position, but never moved more than a few feet from Rusty's body, as if protection was still possible, as if maternal presence could somehow reverse death's finality. "I'm not leaving her," Mike decided. "I'll stay through the night." Neither Frank nor Dr. Carter attempted to dissuade him. They understood that this vigil was as much for Mike's healing as for Stella's comfort, the shared grief of two beings who had fought together and lost. As night deepened, facility staff provided Mike with coffee and a chair. He sat beside Stella, occasionally speaking softly to her or simply sharing the silence. Hours passed in this manner, the treatment stall illuminated only by subdued night lighting. Near midnight, Dr. Carter returned briefly to check on them and prepare a mild sedative for Stella for the morning when they would need to move Rusty's body. "The lab called again," she mentioned, her voice carrying an odd note that caused Mike to look up sharply. "They were quite insistent about their findings. Something about the compounds in Rusty's bloodstream being unlike anything they've documented before. They're sending a specialist tomorrow." "Too late for Rusty," Mike observed grimly. "Yes," Dr. Carter agreed, though something in her tone suggested uncertainty rather than confirmation. After she left, Mike dozed fitfully in the chair, waking frequently to check on Stella. The cow remained standing, her vigil unbroken despite what must have been overwhelming exhaustion. In the deepest part of night, something caused Mike to startle fully awake. A change in the quality of silence, perhaps, or some subtle shift in Stella's posture. The cow had moved closer to Rusty and was intently examining her calf, nudging him with focused purpose rather than grief's gentle touch. Mike rose, approaching cautiously. "What is it, girl?" Stella continued her examination, making soft sounds unlike her earlier vocalizations. Mike moved closer to Rusty, not certain what he was looking for, but compelled by Stella's behavior. Then he saw it, the faintest movement of the calf's side, so slight it might have been imagined. Heart pounding, Mike placed his hand gently on Rusty's chest. For several seconds, he felt nothing. Then, unmistakably, the faintest flutter beneath his palm. "Dr. Carter!" he shouted, not caring about the hour. "Dr. Carter, get in here now!" The facility erupted into activity. Dr. Carter arrived running, followed by night staff responding to the commotion. Lights blazed on, monitoring equipment was hastily reconnected, and disbelief gave way to focused medical assessment. "He's alive," Dr. Carter confirmed, her professional composure momentarily abandoned. "Barely, but he's alive. Heart rate extremely low, respiration almost imperceptible, but definitely present." "How is this possible?" one of the staff veterinarians asked. "He was clinically dead for hours." Dr. Carter shook her head, already administering supportive medications. "I don't know. Some kind of extreme torpor state, perhaps. The lab was trying to tell me something about the compounds in his bloodstream having properties they couldn't identify." Mike stood back, allowing the medical team space to work while keeping one hand on Stella, who watched the proceedings with what seemed like hopeful attention. The moment felt suspended between science and miracle, between rational explanation and something beyond current understanding. Whatever had happened, whatever was happening, defied conventional veterinary experience. Rusty had been pronounced dead, had shown no signs of life for hours, and now was demonstrating the faintest vital signs imaginable. As dawn approached, the story of Rusty's apparent resurrection spread through the facility and beyond. The media, which had been reporting on his death, now scrambled to cover this unexpected development. Social media exploded with theories ranging from scientific speculation to divine intervention. Director Reynolds arrived earlier than expected, accompanied by department officials prepared to collect tissue samples and determine Stella's fate. Instead, they found a treatment stall transformed from a scene of mourning to one of cautious hope, Rusty showing increasingly stable vital signs, Stella standing protective watch, and Mike Harrison, officially terminated but unofficially indispensable, refusing to leave either animal's side. The bureaucratic certainties that had seemed so clear yesterday, about protocols, about invasive species management, about the foolishness of Mike's compassionate intervention, suddenly seemed less absolute in the face of a medical mystery that defied explanation. As morning light filtered through the facility windows, illuminating the continuing efforts to understand and support Rusty's unexpected revival, Mike found himself meeting Stella's steady gaze. In her eyes he saw neither surprise nor confusion, only the patient certainty of a mother who had never abandoned hope, even when everyone else had. "Suspended animation," Dr. Eleanor Carter explained to the assembled group in the facility's conference room. "That's the closest scientific term for what we witnessed." 3 days had passed since Rusty's miraculous revival. The conference room was filled beyond capacity. Director Reynolds and department officials, the university research team, media representatives granted exclusive access, and of course Mike, Frank, and Jenny. Through the observation window, they could see Rusty in the treatment stall, now standing on wobbly legs beside his attentive mother. Dr. Sofia Martinez, the university's leading expert on bat biology, who had been analyzing Rusty's blood samples, took over the explanation. "The compounds we found in the calf's bloodstream contain a complex mixture of anticoagulants, vasodilators, and several proteins. We're still working to identify. But the most remarkable component appears to be a natural compound that dramatically slows metabolic processes without causing cellular damage." "In layman's terms," Director Reynolds prompted, his authoritative demeanor somewhat diminished by the events of the past week. "The vampire bats weren't just feeding," Dr. Martinez clarified. "They were creating a state where the calf's vital functions slowed to nearly undetectable levels, heart rate reduced to perhaps 1 beat per minute, respiration so minimal our equipment couldn't detect it. Yet cellular integrity was maintained." Jenny leaned forward, her scientific curiosity fully engaged. "Are you suggesting this is an evolved feeding strategy? that the bats intentionally induce this state in their prey. The evidence points that way, Dr. Martinez confirmed. The bite pattern analysis supports this theory. They were specifically targeting areas rich in lymph nodes and minor blood vessels, introducing these compounds systematically. Mike, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. So they weren't killing him. They were preserving him. Essentially, yes. Dr. Martinez nodded. Think of it as a living larder. By inducing this state, the bats could potentially feed for days without killing the host or fighting over a decaying carcass. It's an extraordinary adaptation to drought conditions when prey becomes scarce, maximizing a single food source through biochemical manipulation rather than immediate consumption. The implications of this discovery rippled through the room. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward rescue had unexpectedly revealed a previously unknown biological phenomenon, one with potential applications far beyond wildlife management. The medical implications are significant, Dr. Carter added. A naturally derived compound that can induce reversible metabolic suspension without cellular damage. The applications for emergency medicine, organ preservation, even long-term care for certain conditions could be revolutionary. Director Reynolds cleared his throat. While the scientific discovery is certainly noteworthy, it doesn't change the fundamental issues of protocol violation and resource allocation that occurred during this incident. Doesn't it, though? Frank challenged, speaking up for the first time. If Mike had followed protocol, we'd never have discovered this. The calf would have been written off as another invasive species casualty, and a potentially groundbreaking medical discovery would have been lost. The ends don't justify the means in departmental operations, Reynolds countered, though with noticeably less conviction than he might have shown a week earlier. Jenny jumped in. With respect, Director, this case demonstrates exactly why rigid adherence to protocol without allowance for field judgment can be detrimental to scientific advancement. The invasive species we nearly abandoned has provided insight into a biological mechanism we never knew existed. The conversation was interrupted by a staff veterinarian rushing into the conference room. Dr. Carter, you need to see this. The calf, he's responding differently than expected to the latest treatment. The entire group followed Dr. Carter to the treatment area, where Rusty stood beside Stella, seemingly more alert than he had been earlier in the day. What caught everyone's attention, however, was the behavior of both animals when Mike entered the stall. Rusty actually approached him, wobbly but determined, while Stella made soft vocalizations that seemed almost conversational in nature. The bond between the ranger and the animals was unmistakable, a connection that transcended conventional understanding of human-animal interactions. The calf's blood chemistry is stabilizing, the staff veterinarian reported, checking the latest readings, and his wound healing has accelerated significantly in the past 12 hours. It's like once his system fully emerged from the suspended state, it entered an enhanced recovery mode. Dr. Martinez observed the scene with intense interest. The compounds might have therapeutic properties beyond just inducing metabolic suspension. We're seeing similar patterns in the lab samples, cellular regeneration rates unlike anything we'd expect in bovine tissue. As the scientific implications continued to unfold, the media representatives captured every moment, their cameras documenting what was quickly becoming one of the most significant wildlife medicine stories in recent history. The narrative had transformed from a simple rescue to a potentially groundbreaking scientific discovery with far-reaching implications for human and veterinary medicine alike. Amid the excitement, Mike remained focused on Rusty and Stella, his connection with them a quiet constant in the swirl of scientific and administrative activity. When he stroked Rusty's head, the calf leaned into his touch with evident trust. Stella, meanwhile, maintained her protective stance but now accepted others approaching her adopted calf, seeming to understand they meant no harm. DNA results confirmed what you suspected, Dr. Carter told Mike quietly, joining him in the stall. Stella isn't Rusty's biological mother. Their genetic markers show no relation whatsoever. She adopted him, probably after his birth mother died or was separated from the herd. This confirmation of Stella's extraordinary maternal behavior added another layer to the already remarkable story. Not only had she risked her life to protect a calf that wasn't her own, but she had demonstrated problem-solving intelligence in seeking human help, behavior that challenged conventional understanding of bovine cognition. The public response has been overwhelming, Jenny mentioned, scrolling through her tablet. The petition for Stella's protection has reached over 500,000 signatures. 3 private wildlife sanctuaries have offered permanent homes for both animals. And there's a growing movement calling for your reinstatement, Mike. Mike shrugged, his focus still on the animals. The job doesn't matter anymore. What happens to them does. Director Reynolds, who had been observing silently from the edge of the treatment area, approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. The past week had clearly challenged his bureaucratic certainties, forcing a reevaluation of policies he'd long held as absolute. "Harrison," he began formally, then shifted to a more personal tone. "Mike, the department is reconsidering its position on several fronts. The scientific value of this discovery cannot be overstated, and the public response suggests a need to revisit certain aspects of our invasive species management protocols." Mike met his gaze steadily, waiting. "I've been authorized to offer you a position," Reynolds continued. "Not reinstated as a ranger, that ship has sailed given the documented insubordination, but as a special consultant to a new research initiative studying animal cognition and interspecies communication with particular focus on species traditionally classified as invasive or non-native." The offer hung in the air between them, not quite an apology, but a significant concession from a man who rarely admitted the possibility of being wrong. "And Stella and Rusty?" Mike asked, his priorities clear. "They would be the first subjects of the study," Reynolds replied, "protected, with their care overseen by you and Dr. Carter. After the research phase, they would transition to sanctuary placement." Before Mike could respond, Dr. Martinez interrupted with new findings from the university lab. "The compounds we've isolated from the bat saliva show remarkable promise in preliminary testing. They're demonstrating properties that could potentially revolutionize emergency medicine, particularly in trauma cases where slowing metabolic processes could prevent cellular death while transport to medical facilities occurs. Pharmaceutical companies are already expressing interest," Dr. Carter added, "and several medical research institutions have requested collaboration." The conversation quickly shifted to the broader implications of the discovery, how a chance encounter in the Amazon had potentially opened new frontiers in medical science. Patents would need to be filed, research protocols established, ethical considerations addressed. Throughout this discussion, Mike remained beside Stella and Rusty, somewhat removed from the excitement building around the scientific breakthrough. His concern had never been about medical advances or career rehabilitation. It had been about 2 living beings who needed help when no one else would provide it. "You know what's ironic about all this?" Frank said quietly, joining Mike in the stall. "If those bats hadn't attacked Rusty, if Stella hadn't sought human help, if you hadn't broken protocol to follow her, none of this would have happened. Sometimes the right thing and the wrong thing are the same thing, just viewed from different angles." Mike nodded, watching as Rusty tentatively explored his surroundings with growing strength. "I wasn't thinking about scientific breakthroughs or medical advances. I was just looking at her eyes." He nodded toward Stella, "and seeing something that needed the same response I'd want if it were me." Jenny approached with her tablet displaying headlines from around the world. "You've started something bigger than you realize," she told Mike. The Amazon rescue is sparking global conversations about animal cognition, conservation ethics, and the potential for interspecies communication. You're being quoted in scientific journals you've probably never heard of. Mike smiled faintly at the absurdity of it all. All I did was follow a cow. A cow who knew exactly what she was doing, Jenny corrected. The cognitive implications alone are staggering. Stella recognized humans as potential allies, identified a ranger station as a source of help, and successfully communicated her need despite the species barrier. That's not instinct. That's reasoning. The observation gave Mike pause. Throughout his career, he had recognized intelligence in the animals he encountered, had seen problem-solving, emotional responses, and social dynamics that hinted at cognitive processes more complex than many gave animals credit for. But Stella had demonstrated something beyond even his expectations, a level of cross-species communication that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness. As the day progressed, more specialists arrived to examine Rusty and study the compounds that had induced his remarkable suspended state. The facility transformed from a standard wildlife medical center to an impromptu research hub, with experts from various disciplines collaborating to understand the full implications of what they were witnessing. Through it all, Stella remained a calm presence, her maternal vigilance never wavering despite the increased activity around her calf. She seemed to recognize that these humans posed no threat, that they were, in fact, allies in ensuring Rusty's recovery. By evening, Mike found himself sitting alone with Stella and Rusty in a quiet moment between research sessions. The calf had grown stronger throughout the day, now able to nurse and move about with increasing coordination. Stella had finally begun eating regularly again, her own health improving as her adopted calf recovered. "You know, girl," Mike said conversationally to Stella, "you've turned the scientific world upside down, changed how people think about cows, bats, and maybe humans too." Stella regarded him with those large, intelligent eyes that had first captured his attention at the ranger station, eyes that seemed to hold understanding beyond what conventional science attributed to bovine cognition. "And you've done something else too," he continued softly. "You reminded an old ranger why he took the job in the first place. Before protocols and paperwork and politics, back when it was just about recognizing when another living being needs help and doing something about it." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a facility staff member. "Mr. Harrison, there's someone here to see you. Says she's your ex-wife." Mike looked up in surprise. "Sarah?" The woman who entered the treatment stall was in her mid-60s, her once dark hair now silver, her face lined but still recognizable as the person who had shared 20 years of his life before their marriage collapsed under the weight of his grief and alcohol after losing the farm. "Hello, Mike," she said, her voice carrying the slight Tennessee accent he had once found so charming. "Saw you on the news. Thought I'd come see for myself if you'd really given up your career for a cow and her calf." The familiar directness made him smile despite his surprise. "Not just any cow," he replied, gesturing toward Stella. "This one." Sarah approached cautiously, studying both animals with the experienced eye of someone who had grown up on a cattle ranch. "Brahman cross. Good, strong stock." She looked more closely at Rusty. "Calf's not hers biologically, is he? Coloration's all wrong." "No, she adopted him. DNA confirmed it." Sarah nodded, as if this explained something important. "Always said you could judge a person by how they treat animals. Guess the same goes for how animals treat each other." She turned her attention fully to Mike. "You look good. Better than when I left." "Sober, 15 years now," he said simply. "I know. Your sister told me when I ran into her in Nashville a few years back." The conversation paused, decades of shared history and subsequent separation, creating a complex emotional terrain neither seemed eager to navigate in this public setting. "Why are you here, Sarah?" Mike finally asked. She gestured around the facility, at the research equipment, the media presence, the experts gathered to study what he had helped discover. "Because what you did matters, and because—" She hesitated, then continued with characteristic honesty, "Because I wondered if the man who would risk everything for these animals was the same man I used to know before we lost the farm, before the drinking." Mike met her gaze steadily. "I don't know. Maybe something between who I was then and who I became after." Sarah nodded, accepting this. "Well, for what it's worth, I think what you did was right. And I'm glad to see you found your way back to the part of yourself that always cared so damn much about everything." Before Mike could respond, Director Reynolds entered with a media team in tow. "Harrison, we're ready for the official announcement about the research initiative. Your presence is requested." Sarah stepped back. "Sounds like you're needed." "I'll be in town for a few days if you want to catch up properly." As she turned to leave, Stella did something unexpected. She moved deliberately toward Sarah, lowering her massive head in what seemed almost like acknowledgement. Sarah, startled but not afraid, reached out instinctively to touch the cow's broad forehead. "Well, hello to you too," she said with a surprised laugh. "Mike always did have a way with the stubborn ones." The moment was captured by the ever-present cameras, another small chapter in the unfolding story of unexpected connections and recognitions across supposed boundaries of species and understanding. As Mike followed Reynolds toward the press conference, he glanced back at Stella standing protectively beside Rusty, and then at Sarah, who was watching him with an expression that carried echoes of their shared past, and perhaps, just perhaps, possibilities for reconnection. The story that had begun with a desperate mother seeking help for her child had expanded in ways no one could have predicted, challenging scientific understanding, conservation protocols, and even personal histories. What had seemed like endings of a calf's life, of Mike's career, of long-severed relationships, had instead become beginnings of something entirely new. And at the center of it all remained the fundamental truth that had guided Mike's actions from the start. Recognition of another being's need transcends all boundaries we construct, between species, between protocols, between past and present. In that recognition lives our most essential humanity. 6 months later, Mike Harrison stood on the wraparound porch of his rebuilt farmhouse, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in strokes of gold and crimson. The small property, just 40 acres of the original family farm he'd lost decades ago, had been purchased with funds from the consulting position and a surprisingly generous settlement from the department after a congressional inquiry into conservation practices had vindicated his actions. The sound of hooves on packed earth drew his attention to the paddock where Stella grazed contentedly, her massive form silhouetted against the morning light. Nearby, Rusty, no longer a calf but a growing young bull, playfully chased a butterfly, his copper coat gleaming with health. Beyond them, in an adjacent field, several other rescued Brahman cattle formed a small herd, each with its own story of displacement and survival. "Coffee's ready?" Sarah called from the kitchen doorway, her voice carrying easily in the morning stillness. Mike smiled at her, still marveling at life's unexpected turns. What had begun as a cautious reconnection over lunch had gradually evolved into regular conversations, shared memories, both painful and precious, and eventually Sarah's decision to help establish the sanctuary portion of the property. They weren't living together. She maintained her own small house in town. But the easy companionship they'd rediscovered felt like a gift neither had expected. "Coming," he replied, taking a final moment to appreciate the peaceful scene before him. The past 6 months had unfolded with dizzying speed. Dr. Carter and the university research team had established a field laboratory adjacent to the property, studying the remarkable compounds discovered in the vampire bat's saliva. Their findings had already resulted in 2 provisional patents and a groundbreaking paper in a prestigious medical journal, with clinical trials for emergency trauma treatment scheduled to begin next year. Jenny Thompson had transformed from by-the-book biologist to passionate advocate for what she now called cognitive conservation, an approach that considered animal intelligence and social structures in conservation decision-making. Her TED Talk on the subject had gone viral, challenging conventional wisdom about invasive species management and interspecies relationships. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen table was covered with the morning's newspapers and scientific journals. Mike's story, and more importantly, Stella and Rusty's story, continued to capture public imagination and scientific interest. What had begun as a straightforward rescue had evolved into a movement questioning fundamental assumptions about animal cognition, conservation ethics, and the artificial boundaries humans created between species. "You've got visitors coming at 10, Sarah reminded him, pouring coffee into his favorite mug, a chipped ceramic one emblazoned with, "Too old to start over, too stubborn to give up." "The school group from Manaus, and Dr. Martinez wants to collect new samples from Rusty at noon." Mike nodded, accepting both the coffee and the schedule. His days were fuller now than they had ever been during his ranger career, divided between consulting work, sanctuary management, and the steady stream of researchers, journalists, and curious visitors drawn to the property. "Frank called last night," Sarah continued, settling into a kitchen chair. "Says retirement is treating him well, but he misses the excitement, thinking about volunteering here a couple days a week." "Could use the help," Mike agreed. The sanctuary had grown faster than anticipated, with private donations and grants supporting the rescue and rehabilitation of cattle that would otherwise have been culled under invasive species management protocols. Each new arrival reinforced what Stella and Rusty had first demonstrated: the complex social behaviors, apparent problem-solving abilities, and emotional lives of animals often dismissed as mere livestock. The kitchen door opened to admit Dr. Eleanor Carter, who had taken to arriving early most mornings, drawn as much by Sarah's cooking as by the research opportunities. "Morning, you two," she greeted them, helping herself to coffee with the familiarity of a regular visitor. "The lab results came back on those tissue samples from last week. The regenerative properties are holding steady. Rusty's recovery wasn't a fluke. Something in that compound genuinely accelerates healing." The medical implications of their discovery continued to expand. What had begun as research into an unusual feeding behavior had developed into investigations of compounds that could potentially revolutionize trauma medicine, tissue regeneration, and metabolic control. 3 pharmaceutical companies were now funding additional research, with preliminary results suggesting applications that ranged from battlefield medicine to organ transplantation. "Reynolds called yesterday," Dr. Carter added, her tone deliberately casual. "The department's officially revising its protocols on invasive species management. They're implementing a cognitive assessment requirement before any culling decisions, direct result of what we learned from Stella." Mike absorbed this news silently, feeling a complex mix of vindication and lingering resentment. His career had been sacrificed, but the principles he'd fought for were finally being recognized. It wasn't a complete victory. Bureaucracy changed slowly, and there would always be those who favored rigid protocols over compassionate judgment, but it was progress. "He also mentioned they're naming the new approach after you," Dr. Carter continued, watching Mike's reaction closely. "The Harrison Protocol requires field assessment of behavioral complexity and problem-solving abilities before categorizing any species as simply invasive and subject to removal." Sarah reached across the table to squeeze Mike's hand. "Not bad for an old ranger who just followed a cow into the jungle." The self-deprecating description had become something of a family joke, though it belied the profound significance of what had occurred. Mike's simple act of compassion had challenged entrenched scientific assumptions, changed conservation policies, and potentially opened new frontiers in medicine. Outside, a vehicle approached along the gravel driveway, Jenny arriving earlier than expected, accompanied by a film crew working on a documentary about interspecies communication. The sanctuary had become a hub for researchers studying animal cognition, with Stella as the reluctant star attraction. "I'll handle them," Sarah offered, rising from the table. "You finish your coffee." As she left to greet the visitors, Mike and Dr. Carter moved to the porch, watching Stella and Rusty in the morning light. The bond between the mother cow and her adopted calf remained as strong as ever, though Rusty now stood nearly as tall as Stella herself, his adolescent awkwardness giving way to the powerful build characteristic of Brahman bulls. "You know what still amazes me?" Dr. Carter mused. "That day at the ranger station. She walked miles through predator-filled jungle, found a human outpost, and somehow communicated her needs so clearly that even people trained to see her as a problem recognized she was asking for help." Mike nodded, the memory still vivid. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if she'd arrived 10 minutes later, or if we'd been out on patrol." "But she didn't, and you weren't," Dr. Carter replied. "Some might call that luck. Others might call it something else entirely." The philosophical implications of their experience lingered beneath the scientific discoveries. Questions about consciousness, about the artificial boundaries humans constructed between themselves and other species, about the possibility of connections that transcended conventional understanding. The sanctuary had become a living laboratory for exploring these questions. Each rescued animal demonstrated unique personality traits, social preferences, and problem-solving approaches that challenged simplistic views of cattle as mindless livestock. Stella, in particular, continued to demonstrate cognitive abilities that defied conventional explanations, from tool use to apparent intentional communication with both humans and other cattle. The university's Ethical Review Board approved the expanded cognition studies, Dr. Carter mentioned. Non-invasive, of course, just observational and voluntary participation, but if the preliminary findings hold up. She didn't need to finish the thought. If the cognitive abilities they were documenting could be scientifically verified through rigorous study, it would force a fundamental reconsideration of how humans related to and made decisions about other species, particularly those classified as livestock or invasive. The film crew was setting up equipment near the paddock, Jenny directing them with the confidence she'd developed as the project's lead scientist. What had begun as her reluctant participation in a protocol violation had transformed into her life's work, documenting and advocating for recognition of complex cognition across species boundaries. Mike finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch railing. "Guess I should go help with the filming." "Before you do," Dr. Carter said, her tone turning serious, "there's something else." The genetic analysis of the other rescued cattle showed something unexpected. 2 of the females are closely related to Rusty, likely siblings or half-siblings. Mike absorbed this information, its significance immediately apparent. His biological family. Part of it at least, Dr. Carter confirmed. Which means his mother might still be out there somewhere. The Amazon contained hundreds of feral Brahman cattle, descendants of failed ranching operations or escapees from active farms. The possibility that Rusty's biological family might be found raised complex questions about bovine social structures, recognition, and bonds, questions that aligned perfectly with their ongoing research. "We should look for her," Mike decided. Dr. Carter nodded, having anticipated this response. "I thought you might say that Jenny's already applying for the research permits. We could begin tracking in the dry season." The prospect of returning to the Amazon, of potentially discovering another chapter in Rusty's story, stirred something in Mike that he recognized from his ranger days, the pull of unanswered questions, the draw of connections not yet fully understood. Sarah returned to the porch, having directed the film crew to their locations. "School bus just called. They'll be here in 30 minutes. 28 second graders, very excited to meet Stella and Rusty." The sanctuary's educational program had become unexpectedly popular, with schools throughout the region arranging visits so students could learn about animal cognition, conservation ethics, and the remarkable story that had unfolded from a desperate mother's plea for help. "I'll get things ready," Mike said, already moving toward the paddock where special fencing allowed safe interaction with the gentler cattle. As he approached, Stella raised her massive head, her eyes finding him with what still seemed like recognition that transcended ordinary animal awareness. She moved to the fence to meet him, her enormous frame dwarfing his human stature, but her demeanor gentle and familiar. "Got some visitors coming to meet you, old girl," he told her, reaching up to scratch behind her ears the way she preferred. "Think you can handle a couple dozen kids today?" Stella's response was a gentle nudge with her massive head, a gesture that had become her characteristic acknowledgement. Nearby, Rusty approached more energetically, his adolescent enthusiasm still untamed by maturity. Together they formed a picture that belied conventional categories. Not wild, not domestic, not native, not invasive, but simply beings with their own intrinsic worth and complexity. The school bus appeared on the horizon, sunlight glinting off its yellow exterior. Another day of discovery and connection was beginning at the sanctuary. Another opportunity to challenge assumptions about the boundaries between species and the capacity for understanding across those supposed divides. Mike glanced back at the farmhouse where Sarah and Dr. Carter stood on the porch, then to the research facility where Jenny directed the documentary crew, and finally to the expanding sanctuary where dozens of animals once labeled problems now lived in safety. From a single act of compassion, from the decision to follow a desperate mother into the jungle, all of this had grown. "Never underestimate a mother's determination," he murmured to Stella, repeating words that had become something of a mantra at the sanctuary. As if understanding, Stella lowered her massive head to rest briefly against his shoulder. An unlikely friendship between species that had begun in crisis and evolved into something that defied simple explanation. Not quite human, not quite animal, but somewhere in the shared territory of compassion and recognition that remained, perhaps, humanity's most essential frontier. The school bus doors opened, releasing excited children into the morning sunshine. Another day of discovery was beginning. Another opportunity to explore the connections that bind all living things, if only we have the wisdom to recognize them. The bond between Mike Harrison and Stella reminds us that it's never too late to find your purpose. Like many of us in our golden years, Mike faced loss, his farm, his marriage, his career. Yet when that desperate mother cow sought his help, something awakened within him. Their story shows that our most meaningful chapters may still lie ahead, regardless of age. Mike didn't just save Stella and Rusty, they saved him, bringing renewed purpose, reconnection with his ex-wife Sarah, and the chance to rebuild on his old family land. Isn't that what we all hope for? A second chance, a reason to get up each morning, and the discovery that our lifetime of wisdom still matters deeply in this world. The sanctuary Mike created proves that retirement isn't an ending but a beginning, a time to finally live according to our deepest values. Have you experienced an unexpected second chapter in your life that brought renewed purpose? Or is there something calling to you now, a passion or cause that you've always wanted to pursue? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what another person needs to hear today.